Hello there. Let's talk about iteration statement. In this video, we will talk about while, do while, and for. And these are called iteration statement, and these are also commonly called as loops. So whether you call them iteration statement or loops does not matter because they hold the same meaning. But what matters is what they help us in achieving, which is what we're going to cover in this video. But before we get started with any of these, let me tell you how a loop works in general. So any loop that you will come across will have a structure something like this. There would be a condition and there would be a body associated to that loop. Let us talk about each of these one by one, starting with condition. So the condition over here should ultimately give us a Boolean value, which means we will get either true or false. Now, since it should give a Boolean value, there are different ways in which we can put it, right? We can have a literal, or we can have a variable that is assigned a Boolean value, or we can have an expression that evaluates to a Boolean value. Either way, the condition should be of Boolean type. Then comes the body that is associated to the loop. Now, the body that is associated to the loop contains statements that we want to iterate or we want to repeat a certain number of times. It can be just one statement, it can be more than one statement. Either way, the body would contain those statements or those part of the logic which we want to repeat a certain number of times. And if the body contains more than one statement, we will have to use the pair of curly braces. Otherwise, we may or may not use the pair of curly brace. Now, let's come back to this. We discussed that the condition that is associated to the loop should be of Boolean type, which means it will give us either true or false. So let's talk about what happens if it gives us true, and let's also talk about what happens if it gives us false, right? So let's start off with the false value. So if the condition is false, the body that is associated to the loop will not get executed. That means none of the statements inside the body will get executed. But if the condition is true, the body that is associated to the loop will get executed. That's how simple it is. Now, since we are talking about iteration statements, it means that the statements will iterate. That means it will repeat a certain number of times, right? So the statements will repeat so long that the condition evaluates to true. As soon as the condition evaluates to false, the statements will stop executing and the control will come out of the body of the loop. So taking all of these into consideration, the condition can be true at start, right? Or it can be false at start, correct? Now, if it is false at the start, the body won't execute. And if it is true at the start, the body will execute. But like I said, if the condition is true, the body will execute, which means if the condition remains true, it will keep on executing, right? And that means it will never stop. Actually, it will stop, but then it won't stop naturally. It will either have to be killed or it will stop when the memory runs out. So what I'm trying to say is, if the condition is true, it ultimately has to get to a point where it becomes false so that the body stops executing indefinitely and the further logic of the code is executed. If the condition was true at the start and it remains true, we will reach a point where the body keeps on executing indefinitely and it will only stop when it is forcefully stopped or when the program leads to a situation that there's no more memory left. So this is not desirable, which means starting from true and ending in false is absolutely fine. Starting from false is also absolutely fine. What's not desirable is starting from true and the condition remaining true forever. So with this clear, let's take a look at a flowchart which will help you understand this in a better way. So what happens in a loop is the condition is checked, right? And if the condition is true, the block of statement is executed. Once the block of statement is executed, the condition is checked again. And if it is true, the block will be executed again. And this will keep on going. But if the condition becomes false at any point, the loop will stop. There are a few more elements over here that are missing, and you will get to know which elements are those once we complete the discussion of while, do while, and for. But just to give you an idea, the elements that are missing over here has to do with the check condition going to the false path. But again, like I said, you will get to know once we complete the discussion of while, do while, and for. So let's get started with those, starting off with the while loop. Now, what you see in front of you is the syntax of while loop. It starts off with the while keyword, and then there's a condition that is associated to it, and there's a body that is associated to the while loop. And you already know what's happening here, right? This condition would give us either a true or a false. And if it gives us true, the body will be executed. But if it gives us false, the body will not be executed, right? And we also know that the condition may start with true or may start with false. Both of them are okay. But if the condition starts with true, it ultimately has to reach a point where it becomes false. Otherwise, what would happen is the loop will run indefinitely, which is something that we don't want. I'll also demonstrate that to you in a moment. Now, to get a better understanding of while, let's go to IntelliJ and let's write a very simple program using the while loop. And for that, I already have a package called iteration statements created. Here, I'll create a new Java class and I'll say while example. Now, over here, I'll have a main method. And what am I going to do here is, first of all, demonstrate what happens when the condition is false to begin with. So we know that this is how we can write the while loop, right? This condition should be a Boolean value ultimately. So for now, let's say we have a Boolean variable called condition and we set it to false. And what we are going to do right now is we are going to say system.out.println and we are going to say inside while loop. So based on whatever we have discussed so far, what do you think would be the output of this program? Well, if I run this program, what's going to happen is condition, which is a Boolean variable, will be initialized to false. And since condition is false, the body of the while loop will never get executed, right? And also pay attention to the fact that the condition is initialized to false and it has not been changed whole throughout the program, which means it will remain false. So if I run the code, the program should run, but it should not give any output. And that's exactly what is happening. As you can see, the process finished with exit code 0, which means the program compiled and executed successfully, but there's no output getting printed. And that's because we have only one println statement, which is inside a while loop, and that while loop is governed by a variable called condition. And that variable is of Boolean type, which was initialized to false, and it was not changed to true ever. Now, what if I change it to true? And you already know what's going to happen, right? Since the condition variable is a Boolean variable initialized to true, and the condition variable governs this while loop, what's going to happen is, since condition is true, this line will get executed, right? And it will print inside while loop. But the loop will continue and the condition will be true again, and it will print inside while loop again. So far, so good, right? But the problem is the variable condition is not being changed to false ever. So it will keep on going. I will still run the code, but I'll have to forcefully stop it so that it does not crash my application. So let's run the code and see for ourselves. And as you can see, it is going on printing inside while loop. And until I stop it or it crashes the application because it has run out of memory, it will keep on going. So we have discussed what happens when the condition is false to begin with, and we have discussed what happens when the condition is true to begin with. But there's one point left, that is, how do we have a condition which is, let's say, true to begin with, and we ultimately change it to false? For that, let me take a very simple example. So let's say we want to print numbers from 1 all the way up to 10, right? So what are the ways that we can do this? One way is this system.out.println, and we can say 1, then we can say system.out.println, we can say 2, and so on all the way up to system.out.println, and we can say 10, right? Now, if you take a look at this, you'll see a pattern over here, and that is we have system.out.println in all of them. And what's changing is the number that we are printing, right? So if I do it this way, for example, let's make it such that we have a variable called, say, num, which stores 1. So if num is 1 and I say system.out.println num, it will print 1, right? Now, if I change the value of num to 2 and I say system.out.println num again, it will now print 2. And if I change the value from 2 to 3 and then I say system.out.println, it will then print 3 and it should keep on going that way, right? So the only thing that is left over here to discuss is how do I change the value from 1 to 2 to 3 and so on, and how do we ensure that we are stopping here, that is at 10. And since we have one statement which we need to repeat 10 times to get this output, you already know where I am going with this, right? We're going towards the usage of a loop. And since we have discussed only while loop, let's try to use while loop to achieve this. So what we should be doing is we should be having the while keyword and then some condition, right? Now we will also need a body, and we know what to do inside the body. We have to print the value of num, which means we will need a variable called num. And since we want to start from value 1 and go all the way up to 10, what we should be doing is we should be initializing this to 1. And that takes care of initializing num to 1, which means printing 1. But what about the next value? That is 2. And what about the next value? That is 3, and so on. So for that, what we should be doing is we should be increasing the value of num by 1, right? We know we can do this. Or we can also go for num plus plus. Both of them would be fine over here. So what have we done so far? We have a variable called num, which is set to 1, and we have a while loop. The condition is missing, but let's get to it in a moment. And inside the while loop, what are we doing is we're printing the value of num. So it will print 1, right? And then we are going for num is equal to num plus 1, which means num will increase to 2. And when the while loop executes again, it will go for system.out.println num. And this time, what it is going to do is print 2. And then it will increase the value of num again. And this time it will be 3. And then it will print 3. And then it will increase the value again to 4. And it will print 4 and so on. But what we want to do is we want to stop once we have reached 10, right? So let's take this scenario. Let's say the value of num is now 9. So what's going to happen is it will print 9, right? And then num is equal to num plus 1 will increase the value of num to 10. And we want 10 to be printed, right? So we will allow the loop to execute. And then what's going to happen is it will print 10. And then the value of num will increase to 11. Now, when the value of num has become 11, and let's say we allow the while loop to be executed, what would happen? System.out.println will get executed and it will print 11 as well. But that's something we don't want, right? So we will have to stop the while loop from being executed once the value of num has reached 11. And how can we do that? We can do that by ensuring that the condition that we have put over here returns false when the value of num is 11. And the next question is, how can we do that? Well, we can do that by using a condition something like this. While num is less than equal to 10. So let's talk about this condition for a moment, and then let's complete the while loop, and then let's write the code. Fine. So when num is 1, this condition will be true, which means the body of the while loop will get executed. And the same thing would happen if the value of num is 2, 3, 4, and so on, all the way up to 10. Because all of these values, that is 1 to 10, are either less than 10 or equal to 10, right? But the moment the value of num becomes 11, this is no longer less than or equal to 10. So this condition will become false. And if this condition becomes false, what happens is the body of the while loop will not get executed. And that's exactly what we want, right? So we will say num less than equal to 10. So this completes our logic of printing numbers from 1 all the way up to 10. And with this clear, let's go back to IntelliJ. Let's create a new Java class. Let's call it print numbers from 1 to 10. All right. And we can say public static void main. And then what will we have to do is we'll have to say int num is equal to 1. Then we'll have to say while num is less than equal to 10. We will say system.out.println num, and we will say num is equal to num plus 1. And if I run the code, what do we expect to happen? We expect that we will get output from 1 all the way up to 10. And that's exactly what is happening, right? So this is how you can use while loop to print numbers from 1 to 10. So before we get to the next iteration statement, there's one point that I want to talk about. And for that, let me create a Java class and let me call it as while with null body. I'll explain what this means in a moment. Over here, let's have the main method and let's copy whatever we have in the while example class. So copy and paste. Now, what I want to discuss is that over here, we have a body that is associated to the while loop, but it is perfectly fine to not have a body that is associated to the while loop, which means I can get rid of this. But if I get rid of this, I am getting an error. And if I run the code, it would say illegal start of statement. Now, if this is a statement, we should be fine if we end this with a semicolon, right? So if I end this with a semicolon, we see that the error has vanished. And if I run the code now, we won't get any errors. And it is going to continue forever. As you can see, it is not saying process finished with exit code 0 because we started off with true. So if I terminate it forcefully and then change the value to false and then run the code, you would see that the program compiled and executed successfully because it says process finished with exit code 0. But it did not print anything because there's no print statement, and it would not do any calculations or computation because there's no logic associated to the while loop. But the main point over here is it is perfectly fine to have a while loop without a body. And in that case, we will have to terminate it with a semicolon. Now, you must be wondering, where will this be useful? Well, this will be in some cases, but we will talk about it when the time comes. For now, just know that we can have a while loop without any body associated to it. So with this clear, let's move on and discuss the next iteration statement or next loop, which is the do while loop. And the syntax of do while loop is this. We'll have the do keyword and then we'll have the body of the loop. And then we will have the while keyword with the condition. Now, this is somewhat different from the syntax of while loop. In while loop, what happened was we had the while keyword and then there was a condition and there was a body associated to it. So what would happen if the condition evaluated to false in the start, the body of the loop will not get executed at all. But if the condition was true, the body will get executed and it will keep on getting executed till the condition is true, right? But over here in the do while loop, what's going to happen is as soon as the do while loop starts getting executed, first of all, the body of the loop will get executed and then the condition will be checked, which means that if the condition is false to begin with, the body will still get executed once because we are executing the body first and then checking the condition. But if the condition is true, what's going to happen is the body will get executed. Since the condition is true, the body will get executed again and it will keep on going unless the condition becomes false. Now, to demonstrate whatever we have discussed so far, let me go to IntelliJ and first of all, close all of these tabs. Let me create a new Java class and let me call this class as do while example. And let's say public static void main. Now, let's have a variable called condition and let's set it to false for now. What am I going to do is I'm going to say do, and in the body I'm going to say inside do, and then I'm going to have while where I'll say condition. So let me first of all execute the while example class. If you take a look at both of these classes, you see that both of them has got a variable called condition, and in one it is initialized to false, in the other one it is initialized to true. So let me change it to false. Now in the do while example class, we have got do, which prints system.out.println do, and then we've got while. And in the while example class, we have got while condition, and then it prints inside while loop. So let me run the while example class first, and let me show you what the output is. And as expected, it won't print anything, right? But if I do the same thing over here, that is execute the do while example class, let's see what happens. And it says inside do. even if the condition is false to begin with in both, while did not print anything, but do while did. It printed inside do once and then it stopped. Of course, if I change it to true, it will keep on printing forever, like what happened when we had the condition set to true in the while example class. But the main point to note over here is that while will not execute even once if the condition is false to begin with, but do while will execute at least once if the condition is false to begin with. Now, you must be wondering, where would this be useful? That is, having the body of the loop execute at least once, and it will be. Let me take an example to demonstrate this. Let's say we want to take input from the user and we want to force the user to enter a valid input. And by forcing, I mean we will repeatedly ask the user to enter an input until the user enters a valid input. So in that case, what will we have to do? We will print a message for the user saying enter a valid number, and we'll take the input from the user, and then we will check if the number is valid or not. If the number is valid, we will continue. If the number is not valid, we will ask the user to enter the number again, right? So let's try to solve this using the do while loop. For that, let me create a Java class and let me call the class as valid input from user using do while. And over here, let's have the main method. Now, what will we have to do is take input from the user, right? And taking input from the user is a 3-step process. So we'll first of all say import java.util.scanner. This is the step number 1. Then we'll have to create an object of scanner. So we'll say scanner is equal to new scanner system dot in. And then we'll have to take input from the user. But what we want to do is we want to take input from the user until the user enters a valid input. What will we do next is we'll have a do while loop. So we'll say do, and then there would be a body. We'll say while, and there would be a condition. So what are we going to do in the body of do? In the body of do, we need to take input from the user. So we will move this statement here. And before that, we'll say, please enter a positive number, right? Now, let's say user enters a number, say it is 3. Then what should happen? The loop should stop executing there and should continue with the statements that are present after the loop. But if the user enters a negative number, which is invalid according to our definition, the loop should ask the user to enter a number again, right? Which means that the loop should continue if the entered number is less than 0. Now you see that we are getting an error, and we are getting an error because we have defined num in the body of do. And if we define it in the body of do, it will not be accessible outside the body of do, right? So what will we have to do is we'll have to do this. We'll have to say int num, and over here we'll have to remove the declaration. So it will be int num, and then we will iterate, and we will iterate as long as the number is negative. And we will keep on asking the user to enter a positive number and taking the number from the user and then checking, right? So let's say at the end, we are printing num colon and then the value in the variable num. So if I run this code, what's going to happen? The code will ask me to enter a positive number. So I say, for example, -3. And if I press enter, it will ask me to enter a positive number again, because if I enter -3, the condition would be true. And since the condition is true, it means that the user entered a negative number. And since the user entered a negative number, but we want a positive number, we will ask the user to enter a positive number again. And we will keep on doing until the user enters a positive number. And once the user enters a positive number, we will just print that number and we will stop, right? So over here, we have to take at least one input from the user, right? So it may happen that the first input itself is making the condition false, but that's something that is desirable in this situation. Unless we take an input from the user, which means we ask the user to enter a number and then we take that input in a variable, we won't know if the number was positive or negative, which means this part of the loop should be executed at least once, right? Now, if we solve the same thing using, say, while loop, how would it look like? And I'm doing this just to draw a comparison between the usage of while and do while in this case. So let me also copy the main method from here and let me paste it over here. Now we won't need do while, we know that, right? So what am I going to do is I'm going to say system.out.println, please enter a positive number over here. And then I'm going to say int num is equal to scanner.nextInt. And what am I going to do next is get rid of the do while, but I'll copy the condition that I have for while along with the keyword. Now what we should be doing? We should be asking the user to enter a positive number. Then we should be taking the input from the user and then we would be checking. And here what we would have to do is if the number is less than 0, we will have to do the same thing. That is, we'll need to ask the user to enter a positive number and we will have to take the input from the user. So if I enter say -1, the condition will become true. It will say, please enter a positive number, and then it will wait for my input. And this will keep on going until the value of num is less than 0. Once the value of num is greater than 0 or 0, it will stop and it will print the number, right? So if I run this code, it is asking to enter a positive number. I say -21. It will ask me again. I'll say -100. It will ask me again, and I'll say 100. This time it will print the value of num and it will stop. So if you take a look, both the classes are doing the exact same thing. That is asking the user to enter a number and forcing the user to enter a positive number. But you see this code and compare it with this code. Over here, we have asked the user to enter a number and then we got inside the while loop and then we are asking the user to enter a number again. But that is not required in the do while loop, because if you take a look at the logic, you'll see that we will need to take at least one input, right? And if we have some portion of the code which we need to run at least once, do while is better suited than while, which is evident from this example itself. So with this clear, let's move on and let's talk about the for loop. The versions of Java starting from JDK 5 has got two forms of for loop, the traditional for loop and the for each loop. The traditional for loop is the one that has been in Java since the beginning, and for each loop was introduced in JDK 5. However, in this video, we will focus our attention to traditional for loop and we won't talk about the for each loop, because discussing about the for each loop would need the knowledge of arrays or collection, etc. And we have not discussed any of that yet. So let's talk about traditional for loop in this video, and we will talk about for each loop, but later when we talk about arrays or collections. So continuing with traditional for loop, let's take a look at the syntax of the traditional for loop. Traditional for loop will start with the for keyword. But if we compare it with the syntax of do while, for example, which started with do, had a body, and then a condition at the end, or while loop, for example, which started with while, which had a condition first, and then the body, the for loop will look a little different. We've got a few things over here: initialization, condition, and iteration. And then we have the body of the loop. So let's discuss about each of them one by one, starting with initialization. So initialization, as the name suggests, initializes some value. For example, we can say something like for int I is equal to 0. This is initialization, right? We are creating a variable called I of int type and we are initializing 0 to it. Then we have got condition and we already know what this condition would be used for, correct? The loop would continue as long as the condition is true. But as soon as the condition becomes false, the loop will stop. So we can have a condition something like this. For example, I less than 10, right? And lastly, we have got iteration. Now, iteration over here refers to the expression which usually increases or decreases the value of the variable that we have used in initialization. So something like this, for example, I is equal to I plus 1. And then we'll have the body. So let's say we're just printing the value of I in the body. So this is how a for loop would look like. Now this variable I over here, which is used in initialization, is called the loop control variable, because that variable in a way determines the execution of the loop. As you can see over here, I is set to 0 and the condition is set to I less than 10 and I is getting increased by 1 every time. So let me explain how this for loop would execute. So what would happen is, first of all, the initialization would take place. That is, I will be initialized to 0. Then the condition will be checked. So it will check if I is less than 10 or not. If the condition is true, the body of the loop gets executed, which means this is third. And once the body of the loop is executed, it will go to this expression, which increases the value of I. So this will be fourth. So what's going to happen is I will be set to 0. I is less than 10. That is true. So it will print I and then it will go and increase the value of I from 0 to 1. Now, once this happens, the initialization won't be done again. It will just check the condition. So this will be fifth. And then once this is done, the result would be true because I is 1 and we are checking for I less than 10. So it will execute the body and the body will print the value of I, right? So this will be sixth. And then once the body executes, we know what happens. It goes to this expression and it increases the value to 2. So this would be 7. And then that's how it will continue, which means it will go check the condition. If the condition is true, it will execute the body. And after executing the body, it will increase the value of I. Then it will check the condition again, execute the body, increase the value of I. And it will keep on going unless the value of I is 9 and it gets printed and it gets incremented to 10. In that case, the condition will become false. And since the condition is false, the loop will terminate. So if you noticed, the initialization is done only once and then it moves between checking the condition, executing the body, and updating the value of the variable. So this is how traditional for works. So now let's go to IntelliJ and let's write a small and simple program to demonstrate for loop. And let's create a class called for example. And over here, I'll say public static void main, and I'll say for int I is equal to 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus, right? And all I'll do is go for system.out.println I, and then I'll run the code. And as you can see, it will start from 0 and go all the way up to 9. Because what happens after we print 9? After 9 is printed, I will be incremented by 1. It will become 10. And since 10 is not less than 10, the condition becomes false and the loop terminates. And of course, this I plus plus can also be written as I is equal to I plus 1. And if I run the code, it will give us the same output. And like all the other loops, if there's just one statement, there's no need of a curly brace. So if I remove the curly brace and I put system.out.println I this way, and I run the code, I'll still get the same output. So no errors, and we are getting the exact same output. And also the expression that you have over here to update the value of I need not increment the value of I just by 1. It can increment by 3, for example. And if I run the code, it will still give me some output. It will say 0369 and so on. Or you can have any expression to modify the value of I. So in short, in this for loop, but before I discuss, let me put the curly braces back. Okay, so in this for loop, we have got a variable called I, which is being initialized over here in the for loop. And this variable is called the loop control variable. And this is initialized to 0. Then we have got the condition, and the loop will run as long as the condition is true. And if the condition is false to begin with, the loop won't run at all. For example, if I set the value of I to 100, for example, and then I run the code, you'll see that it won't print anything. So similar to the while loop, the for loop also checks the condition first and then executes the body of the loop. And this is different from the do while loop, right? Where the do while loop executes the body of the loop first and then checks the condition and then proceeds from there. So coming back to the for loop, we've got a condition over here. And if the condition is true, the body of the loop will get executed. And if the condition is false, the body will stop executing. Once the body of the loop is executed, the value of the variable I will be modified and then the condition will be checked again. And if the condition is still true, the body of the loop will be executed and the value of variable I will be modified again. Now, another point over here is, since we have declared the variable I in the for loop, we can access it inside the block of the for loop. But if we try to access it outside, say here, for example, you see that we are getting an error. And if I still run the code, I will get cannot find symbol. That symbol is I, and the location is the for example class in the iteration statements package, and it is in line number 9. So if I click this, it will take me over here. So if for some reason you want to access the value of variable I outside the for loop, what you can do is this. You can say int I and then straight up say I is equal to 1 in the for loop. And if I run the code now, you'll see that it is printing 147 and then it is lastly printing 10. And this 10 is because we are printing the value of variable I outside the loop. So if I run the code with this change, what do I expect? I expect 147 and then dash 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 and then 10. So depending on whether you need to access the loop control variable outside the loop or not, you can either declare it over here and then initialize it in the for loop, or you can declare and initialize in the for loop itself. Now, another point over here is you might need to declare more than one variable. And in that case, what should you be doing is you should be using comma. So you can say something like int I is equal to 1 and say j is equal to 1. And as you can see, this is perfectly fine. If I run the code, there won't be any errors. And similar to this, you might want to change the value of j like you're changing the value of I. So you can say, for example, j is equal to j plus 2. And now also you cannot see any errors. And if I run the code, I will get output. The process will finish with exit code 0, which means it compiled and executed successfully. If you need to initialize more than one variable or you need to update more than one variable, you can do so with the help of comma. Now, if you're wondering if we can use comma over here or not, the answer is no. This thing, that is the one that comes after initialization and before the loop control variable is updated, is called condition, and it should result in a Boolean value. So you cannot use a comma, but then if you want to use I and j and some form of condition on them, you can combine them in such a way that it gives you a Boolean value ultimately. So for example, if you say I less than 10 and j less than 10, this is perfectly fine because this is just an expression which is of Boolean type, which means it will give us either true or false, which is acceptable when the for loop is considered in Java. Now, along with the value of I, let's also print the value of j, and let's run the code. So if we run the code, we get 43, and 75. And this is happening because we are incrementing the value of j by 2. So it will start with 1, it will become 3, and then it will become 5. And since the condition says I less than 10 and j less than 10, it will stop when the value of I becomes 10. The value of j would not have become 10 by then because j is increasing just by 2. That is increasing slowly compared to the value of I. But because I less than 10 is false, this entire condition will become false. Now let's solve a simple question using the for loop. And let me explain that question to you first. Let's say the question is printing all of the even numbers up to n. And let's assume that n is a positive number. So for example, if n is say 8, the output would be 2, 4, 6 and 8. If n is say 11, the output would be 2, 4, 6, 8 and 10. So as you can see, if n is an even number, it will print up to n. But if n is an odd number, then it will print up to the last even number, which is smaller than n, right? So what can we do over here? We will need to start from the smallest even number, and we will have to go to the next even number and we'll have to print that, and we'll have to keep on doing unless we reach a point where we are beyond the value of n, right? So if n is equal to 8, this is what we'll have to do. Start with 2, print 2, increase to 4, print 4, increase to 6, print 6, and increase to 8 and print 8, right? And once it reaches 10, we will stop because 10 is beyond the value of n. Now, if it was, say, 11, for example, what will we do over here? Start with 2, print 2, then increase this to 4, print 4, then 6, print 6, 8, print 8, 10, print 10, 12, but then don't print because 12 is greater than the value of n, right? So what we can do is we can just start from 2 and go all the way up to n, that is including n. And we will keep on printing as long as the number does not exceed n. So if we take this logic and try to put this using for loop, this is what it can look like. We'll say int, let's say I is equal to 2 because we need to start from 2, right? And then we'll say I less than equal to n because what have we just discussed is we will need to go all the way up to n. Now, if n is an even number, it will get included in the iteration. And if n is an odd number, what will happen is the largest even number that is smaller than n will get printed. And then the value of I will increase to 12 in this case, assuming the value of n is 11. And 12 is greater than 11. So what's going to happen? This condition will become false, right? And in the iteration expression, we'll say I is equal to I plus 2. And over here, we'll just print the value of I, right? And we can also write this as this I plus equal to 2. Both of them are going to give us the same result, right? So with this discussed, let's come back to IntelliJ. Let's close this. Let's create a new Java class. Let's say even numbers using for. And let's say public static void main. Let's say the value of n is 8 for now. And let's write the code. We'll say int I is equal to 2, I less than equal to n, I plus plus, and we'll just print the value of I. That is it. And if I run the code, what do I get? I get 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, my bad. I should have gone for I plus equal to 2. Muscle memory, sorry. So if I run the code now, I get 2, 4, 6, 8. And if I change this to, for example, 11, and I run the code, I get 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So this code is working perfectly fine. Now, the next point to discuss is nested loop. And if you've watched my video on selection statement, you know that there's something called nested if. And nested if is just one variation of if inside another variation of if. Similarly, nested loop is one loop inside another loop. It can be a for inside a while, it can be a while inside a for, it can be for inside do while or do while inside for, and all of the combinations that you can think of. So let me demonstrate that by taking a very simple example for which I'll create a class and I'll name this as nested loop. Let's have a main method and let's say we have a simple for loop which says for int I is equal to 1, I less than 10, I plus plus. Now let's create another loop inside for and let's say even this is a for loop. So we'll say for int, can I say I is equal to 1? No, right? Because we already have the variable I declared in this block. So we cannot declare a variable with the same name in the same block. So we'll say int j is equal to 1. By the way, let me demonstrate what happens if I say I. If I say I, we get an error and it says variable I is already defined in the scope. So let me change it back to j. Let's say j is less than 10 and j plus plus. And let's print the value of I and also print the value of j. And if we run the code, we will get 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3 up to 1, 9. And then it will go for 2, 1, 2, 2 up to 2, 9. And it will go all the way up to 9, 9. So this is how a nested loop looks like. And this brings us to the end of the video. But before we wrap up, there are a few things that I wanted to mention. And the first one of them is that there are a lot of interesting questions that we can solve with the knowledge of loop. I did not take them up in this video because it would have made the video very, very long. But I will have a separate video where I will take up all of those interesting questions that I can find using loops and we will solve them in that video. Secondly, with the introduction and discussion of loop, we can see that we have introduced a few blocks in the code. And with block, comes the discussion of scope and lifetime of variable. Now, I'm not getting into the details of scope and lifetime of a variable with respect to the blocks associated to a loop, because I've already covered them in detail in the selection statements related video. And if you're interested, I will link that video and you can access that video by clicking the card that's appearing over here. You need not watch the entire video. What you can do is go to the description and check the timestamp and jump to the specific timestamp where I'm talking about the scope and lifetime of variable. And so with that, we come to the end of this video. And summarizing, we talked about loops, right? We talked about the for loop, the while loop, and the do while loop. We also talked about the differences between them with respect to what happens if the condition is false to begin with. And lastly, we also talked about the nested loop. So I hope I've been able to teach you something new and useful. If you have any suggestions, feedback, or queries, feel free to put them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.